Hi, I'm ED-SKaR, and this, at long last, is Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt, later Lord Militant and Lord Executor, and commander of the Tanith First and Only Regiment of Imperial Guard, who commonly use the nickname Gaunt's Ghosts, both for their renowned abilities in stealth, making them near invisible when they want to be, but also due to the loss of their homeworld, making them feel a little more than spectres passing from one planet to the next. The loss of Tanith can certainly not be attributed to Gaunt himself, but rather an overzealous push in the Sabbat World's crusade that left openings for arch-enemy splinter fleets to scatter throughout the Sabbat World's cluster. One such splinter fleet found Tanith and attacked it and pretty much wiped it from existence. The newly promoted Colonel-Commissar Ibram Gaunt was on Tanith at the time, taking command of 3 regiments of Imperial Guard, the Tanith 1st, 2nd and 3rd. However, when the attack came, he ordered for as many as he could off-world to escape, rather than to have a few thousand untrained soldiers go up against a force many times their size and many times their experience. The rescued soldiers were amalgamated into a single regiment, the Tanith 1st, or the Tanith First and Only, if you will. But the Tanith soldiers never really forgave Gaunt for this decision. Even though it saved their lives, many of them would have rather died defending their home than been gallivanting off around the universe saving other worlds. So this model is the last of the 2002 Gaunt's Ghosts box that I have been painting through in recent days. And in a classic case of saving the best for last, I wanted to make sure that Gaunt got my best work. Or at least better than the others in the squad. Much of the painting style that I used for Gaunt here is very similar to the style of all of the other models in the set. However, I'm trying to take things to the next level, if you'll excuse the expression. Just trying to put that little bit extra into all of the little details so that it fits the style and it looks right next to the others, but it also stands out for being hopefully a little better painted. Naturally, any time that I try to do anything properly, disaster strikes. And disaster first strikes in the form of my brush deciding to fray apart. Now in this camera shot you see it's kind of split into 2 even parts. At some points during painting this model it split into 5 parts and just a little crown of separate brushes and just caused me all sorts of trouble. Now I did clean out the brush and I did use some soap to try and reform it, and that held for just long enough for disaster to strike a second time. This time in the form of my painting handle dismantling itself while I was trying to adjust it. Now for anyone who's been asking about this painting handle, this is a custom design that I have designed from scratch myself to try and give me the motion and positioning that I want to hold a model in just the right angle so that I can paint any particular feature. My original idea came from using a solid painting handle, and I ended up just turning it upside down in my hand and painting upside down fairly frequently, and so I wanted to have a painting handle that I could do that with without having to go into some awkward position. However, once I actually got it made and started using it for a couple of models, I found that having a model sideways was far more useful. If you're trying to paint the boots, or if you're trying to paint eyes, or if you're trying to paint certain aspects like under the armpits and difficult places to reach, throwing the model onto its side and rotating it slowly round gives you just about every angle you could possibly hope for to be able to paint a nice clean coat on the entire model. However, this is still a prototype, this is only my second version of it, and so clearly there are some things I need to do, like put a stop on the top of that part so that it doesn't fall off. So going back to how I'm doing this model slightly differently from the others. With the others I took a particular colour, did a base coat, and then mixed that colour with a lighter colour to create a highlight, and then put the highlights on. With Gaunt, I kind of went around and did a lot of the base coating first, and then came back to do some of the highlighting later. Essentially very much the same thing, just in a slightly different order. One colour that I am using differently here is yellow, and by differently I mean it's the first time I've used yellow in this entire set, and because yellow pigments are notoriously difficult, and there are some good paints out there, but I don't have any, I'm going to be using a trick that I picked up recently, and that is to underpaint the areas that are going to be yellow in a pink paint first. Even if the pink paints are not directly visible, because the yellow is translucent, what you end up with is a vibrant looking yellow. And a vibrant yellow, and of course a strong red, are important colours in the uniform of the Commissariat, which Gaunt of course wears as half of his rather unusual position. Holding a dual rank of Colonel-Commissar, he is both a colonel, the first in charge of the Tanith First and Only, but he is also a commissar, a political or morale enforcing officer that's not usually a command rank. But Gaunt quickly manages to balance the two sides of his role, commanding and inspiring his troops, but also disciplining them when necessary. And generally speaking, not one for the quick summary executions that the Commissariat are famous for. And now I'm going to show you the third time that disaster has struck during the painting of this model, this second time again due to the painting handle. While looking down, you can see that there is a recess in the handle for the dial directly under the model, so that when you have it completely upright, you can slide it down and have it closer to your hand. Unfortunately, if you're not careful, that recess can then catch on parts of your model, and Gaunt's pose here is a very leaned forward pose with that sword of Hieronymo outstretched in front, and yes, disaster struck. Which got me worried for a moment, because firstly this is a pewter model, and bending pewter back into place can be a bit sketchy at times, but also this model is getting to be quite rare. Given that it was not a particularly popular run, and that run was 18 years ago, the cost of buying this model again on eBay, I'd rather avoid that. Thankfully, I did manage to very carefully bend that sword back in line, and the panic was over for the third time. After the fall of Tanith, the soldiers slowly began to respect Gaunt. Whilst many commanders in the Imperial Guard would send wave after wave of thousands of men to their deaths simply to clog the enemy's guns, Gaunt worked hard to put the Tanith First and Only into positions where they could play to their strengths. Now, very often other officers and those in high command got in his way, but as time went on and the regiment became more renowned, they were put more and more into positions where their strengths shone. Rather than being foot-slogging line infantry, they would be used as a light scout force, able to recon, infiltrate, and more often than not, wreak havoc. However, just as it took a while for the Tanith soldiers to learn to respect Gaunt and mostly forgive him for his part in removing them from Tanith at its time of most need, so too did Gaunt spend a long time learning to respect the Tanith soldiers themselves. What was supposed to probably be a temporary posting in Gaunt's mind, that he would take command of this regiment for a while and eventually be assigned somewhere else, promoted, preferably to a rank with better pay. The events of the founding led to him being pretty much stuck with them for quite a considerable length of time. Now, one of the short stories by Dan Abnett really shows that there was a time when Gaunt was giving serious consideration to requesting a transfer away from the Tanith First and Only, his very own Gaunt's Ghosts. And were that the case, even with Corbeck or Rawn in charge, another commissar would have to be assigned, and the biggest force fighting for Gaunt's Ghost's survival, that of Gaunt himself, would have been taken away, and they would have probably have been thrown into the meat grinder and ceased to exist. But Gaunt did learn to respect the soldiers of the Tanith First, to see their strengths and value them, to be able to choose which soldiers to put into which positions, who to trust to send out scouts, who to trust on a demolition squad, and who to send to a neighbouring regiment on a billet ship with some unofficial information, and maybe even who to trust to clean his uniform. And while we're talking about Gaunt's uniform, I'll talk about the yellow again. With the pink base layer that I painted on earlier, the yellow goes on vibrantly and brightly, which is of course what I was aiming at. Now, my finished colour won't look anything like this. This is far too bright for the grimdark future, after all. However, it's a very good step on the way to the finished yellow that I'm after. And naturally, because it's too bright at the moment, I'm going to highlight it, because it still needs highlights. So falling back to the same wet blending technique that I've used in the rest of the series, I'm going to mix yellow with some white, and then after that I'm going to come back and spot the top of the buttons with some pure white to really get that kind of bright highlights exactly how I want them. Now some of you will be thinking, why on earth am I making this so bright and vibrant when I've just talked about making it grimdark and 40k? Well, some of you also may have realised that I'm going to put on a wash. Now I have used washes here and there in the set so far, but I've kind of leaned away from using them, mainly because I wanted to get each one of the models out relatively quickly. But also because I wanted to concentrate on really learning the wet blending technique that I've been honing recently. And I'm still not there yet, but I'm better than I was 6 models ago. So the bright yellow will be getting a brown wash, because brown is a very good shade colour for yellow, whereas most of the rest of the model is getting a black wash. Because I want all the models to tie in together, I'm very specifically not putting any wash over the Camo Cloak. But I am putting a black wash over the black uniform and the black cap. Because what better to put over a black uniform than a black wash? This is actually far more useful than you might think, because I've highlighted the black up into grey. And my wet blending skills, even 6 models later, aren't amazing. And so what the black wash will do is help me out by hiding some of the transition, smoothing it over, so that it goes from a now muted grey into the darker black. And I will just briefly mention how I paint the Camo Cloak, even though it's exactly the same method as I've painted all of the other Camo Cloaks in the set so far. I start with a dark green base coat, and then I mix the dark green with a lighter green to create highlights. Then I'll fill in the camo pattern with pairs of other colours, a light and dark brown, an ochre and a sand, and a black and a grey. With each of the darker colours I will randomly paint small stripes all over the Camo Cloak. Then, wherever those stripes cover the highlight in the green, I'll bring its paired lighter colour in and paint the highlight just on the stripe. The idea of this is so that the highlight isn't in any of the colours, the highlight is over everything in an area, and it seems to work, so I've stuck with it. But now that we're getting towards the end of this series of videos, I really should mention the series of books that all this is derived from. The Gaunt series of books written by Dan Abnett. So Dan Abnett is a relatively well-known science fiction author, having written for Warhammer 40k not just the Gaunt novels but a chunk of the Horus Heresy series as well. He's also written for 2001 AD and some of the famous Judge Dredd comics, as well as Doctor Who and Torchwood as well, to name just a few. And the next book on my reading pile is Tomb Raider: The 10,000 Immortals by Dan Abnett and Nick Vincent. Now I don't know when exactly I got into the Gaunt series, but I know it was relatively early on. I have somewhat of a recollection that when I got into reading the series there were 3 books, so that would have been First and Only, Ghostmaker and Necropolis. But I don't know if I started reading them before Necropolis came out, or whether it was because of the advertising for Necropolis that I finally picked up some of the books. Regardless of exactly where and how it happened, I was hooked pretty much immediately. Vivid characters, meaningful action, and plenty of stuff away from the action that was coherent. And that makes for a far more enjoyable read. Now the observant amongst you may have noticed that I've been putting something off. That sword that was so close to being utterly destroyed earlier still only has its grey primer. Well, I've painted pretty much the entire rest of the model, so I can't put it off much longer. Now my plan going into this was to try and copy the style of the sword when I painted the statue of a Sister of Battle some time ago, using a light blue and then a very light greeny blue, once again wet blending them together and trying to make a nice transition. And you'll also notice that I've changed camera angle once again, and that's just because I'm at least trying to capture some of this on camera to the best of my abilities. And let's face it, videography is not one of my specialities. Now I wouldn't call the painting of the sword as a disaster, I've had 3 of those already this video, but it certainly didn't come out anywhere near as good as I had hoped, and it certainly doesn't look as good as the sword on the Sister of Battle statue. However, after having gone back and forth over it with a grand total of 2 paints for a grand total of nearly an hour, I really thought that I wasn't going to achieve any more just by forcing it, so once I got to a point that I was roughly happy with it, I wound it up and called it there. And with the sword finally done, now the entire model is done. Remembering, of course, that I'm not painting the bases in the model painting videos. I have a separate video coming, and I'll do the bases there. And some of the photography that I'm showing off here is actually from Amethyst Quill. So thank you to Amethyst Quill for helping me out. All in all, this model came out pretty well in comparison to my perception of my abilities. There are many parts that I wish I had done better, but there are many parts of this model that I'm really happy with how they came out. But now that we're all done, I can put Gaunt on the shelf and say that I'm ED-SKaR, always will be, and thank you very much for watching.